You know, I think it comes with the territory. That we're definitely fighting an insurgency, and but our focus, you know, the issue of Afghanistan, and I don't know how many of you have been there or spent time in the region. I'm sure some of you have. It's a very tribal-oriented society, an ancient, old society. And you know, when we think of President Hamid Karzai, he kind of reflects, people call him the mayor of Kabul, and a lot of people joke around that he lives in a bubble and he never comes out. So there's a huge disconnect for the people of Afghanistan, the tribes in the north, in the south, in the west, in the east, from the centralized government that we have, you know, kind of elevated to this pedestal. And, you know, obviously we see with WikiLeaks and with, I mean, let's just not even look at WikiLeaks, the numerous reports over the last 4 years about the enormous amount of corruption and the difficulty for us to move forward in Afghanistan. Now, you talked about the ANA and the Afghan security forces. You're absolutely right. This is something that happens, I mean, frequently. I mean, we're in a war. We expect to see this. It's going to be difficult to get these guys off the ground. I don't believe it's hopeless. I don't. And I've seen evidence of this. You know, this is, let me tell you really quickly a story. When I was in Afghanistan this last time, a director, a film producer for Dan Rather was actually out there. He was from England, and he was with one of the Army units. And he and I kind of met up at CAF before we headed out on our other deployments. CAF is Kandahar Airfield. And he was shooken up. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "You know, we've been hit 4 times with IEDs. I survived 4 IED attacks in the last 2 weeks." And I said, "Yeah, that's pretty difficult. How close were you to the IEDs?" He said, "We were really close." He said, "I'd like to show you some of my footage." So I sat down with him, and in one part of the footage, there was a young Afghan interpreter walking with a U.S. commander. And it wasn't, I mean, the photographer was feet away from when this happened. I mean, you could see how close he was. He got blown back, but the IED went off, and the Afghan interpreter believed, I mean, threw his body on top of the commander to save the commander's life and lost his own. So there are Afghan allies. There are people out there that want to trust us. It isn't hopeless. We saw that in 2001. I think the problem is that the message got so mired, and they don't, at this point in time, with the resurgence of the Taliban, with the problems that they see in Kabul, there's this distrust that has grown, and we've lost the message. I don't even know if we ever accurately delivered the message to the Afghan people, if we failed in that respect, you know, in that part. But I know that our troops are trying their best. As far as the Afghan National Army, there is a very serious problem, and I think it becomes more of a problem when we cover up the truth. We can't solve the problem if we're telling a skewed truth about what's going on there. Our troops are having a very difficult time with them. Their commanders are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm not talking about our commanders, I'm talking about the Afghan commanders. Obviously, there are some sections of the Afghan army which we're seeing progress in, and they call it the Afghan Special Forces, but then there's a debate there. There's a debate there as well. So there's a lot of difficulty. The worst thing we could do, though, is not get the stories out, because we can't fix anything. It's 2 years from now, we're going to be in the same problem if they don't start doing something now about it. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
I would add one thing to your presentation, and that is be very literal. Trying to train police force in an army who do not speak, do not read or write, and do not speak, we have very few translators that speak the language, is a different from other wars. We are trying to turn this war over to a military, a local military, and police force that just to train them we have to use pictures. So how do you get
pictures
and explain to them what this is about for you. One, don't speak their language, and two, they don't believe you. That's the difference, even from Iraq, which was a very educated society.
Absolutely.
Incredibly, 90% of Afghanistan is illiterate.
You're absolutely right on that. I mean, that's a huge, huge problem. The illiteracy rate is enormous. We we don't have enough translators. For example, in the South, in southern Afghanistan, I was very fortunate that one of the ladies that I was with, she is an Afghan but an American citizen. She was with me during my trip, and she spoke Pashtun, which is enormously difficult to find a Pashtun translator in that part of the country that can work with you, that you can trust. Most of the translators that our military uses speak Dari, which is almost a form of Iranian, it's a Persian language, and it's very different from the Pashtun language. The problem too is that a lot of the men that are joining the military, I talked to a lot of the Afghan soldiers, they want the money. And as soon as they feel that we're backing out, they're going to go. They told me, we're not going to stay. If you're not going to stay here and back us, we're not going to stay here and fight. What are we fighting for? We're just here. We're going to make some money, and then we're going to, and I don't know if you heard the same thing while you were there. Yeah, and so it is different. It is different than Iraq, where there was a real sense of nationalism and, well, okay, we're going to build our army back. We're going to fight. We're educated. We're going to move forward. Afghanistan, once again, very tribal and broken, and very difficult.
David, did you want to answer the question to you? You had a question to you.
The question about essentially whether journalists or reporters might do us the favor of letting us know their biases up front. On that, it would seem that there are those like Juan Williams and Geraldo Rivera who are perhaps in the opinion business. There are also those who are not, who are the reporters at the news side of newspapers and at magazines, at television networks and the like. I don't know quite what that sort of disclosure would look like from ABC and NBC News correspondents and Washington Post reporters. It seems that the test is in the execution, and this question of bias, I actually think that Bill's example was really extremely interesting. The question of bias in let's say doing a newspaper report would seem to come up at least 2 points.
Bias is not just simply a question of their obvious sympathy for Palestinians, but in some cases the concern for their lives. That on 9/11, Palestinians were dancing in the streets, and apparently, according to Stephanie Gutman in her book The Other, no uncertain terms to yank that footage. There have been a number of networks with correspondents that have been taken hostage. And as a result, for example, they will uncritically present statements by Hezbollah. There were some fake, Hezbollah was caught with some photographic fraud in the 2006 Lebanon war. But it's the habit, they will go to Palestinian spokesmen all the time, and they will simply uncritically repeat those lies. And they don't disclose to the folks back home that part of the reason they may be doing it is that they are under a kind of threat, which I would think should have led news organizations to say, in that case, we won't cover you at all. There's no effort to do that. Of course, that would require the cooperation of the European journalists, too.
You have a very good point there, and unfortunately, that does happen. And I don't cover the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but I have done stories about the region, and I have some friends who are reporters that have gone in to Gaza and who have report from Israel, and it's very difficult for them. And it's very difficult to get the story across, you're right, particularly when certain news organizations do have a certain bias towards or have political feeling about what should be done in that region of the world. And I've seen it myself. I've seen it skewed. I don't know if you have. I know that in certain aspects of that particular area of the world, that's when you start to see certain news organizations show their colors and what they believe. Bill, do you cover that area frequently?
Well, yeah, I
mean,
we could probably have a whole separate conference on,
because that's a
bias in reporting in the Middle East.
I mean,
sure.
that's definitely one of the issues that I know that for a lot of folks, that's a major difficulty. I have a friend who lived in Israel for 2 years. She was Jewish. She went into Gaza. It was very difficult for her. She went into the region, particularly after the takeover. She wanted to see how women were being treated. It was very dangerous for her. She reported those stories regardless. She spent more than a year covering women in that particular region and the changing lifestyle for them, and made it back out. But she and I had talked about that, and she had said she was really devastated at the fact that a lot of foreign media just did not pay any attention to the real crisis that was going on. And here she is, you know, she's Israeli, she's Jewish, and she's writing stories about Muslim women and how their lives have changed in Gaza, you know, after the takeover and what happened to them. She sacrificed a lot to get those stories out, and she could have ended up sacrificing her life. So it was really disheartening for her name's Brenda Gazzar, but it was really disheartening for her to see that so many people avoided that and ignored what was really happening there. And you're right, there were a lot of people chanting in the streets after.
Okay, how about back there and then here?
I'm not sure this is a journalist reporter question, but the issue was raised that the Afghans view it as incumbent upon us to support them and to rid their country of terrorism. And I can't help but ask anybody who's been there if the political will really exists among the local tribes to eradicate the Taliban. And if it doesn't, what realistically is our goal? And is there any end in sight to this loss of life and the incredible cost to our society and to our military personnel?
It's a great question. I don't know if you guys want to answer this as well, and I'll try to make it short. I mean, that's the question I have for all the commanders. What's the end game? What would conceivably we would say, how would we say we've won here? What does that mean, winning? And, you know, they backed away from that. They backed away from saying we're going to win something here. In the beginning, I believed that a lot of the tribe, particularly those that supported the U.S. and the NATO effort, were going to be there and back us. And I mean, I remember traveling into the north years ago. Former commanders with the Mujahideen took me for a very long journey into the north and talked to me about their fight against the Soviets, and told me that the people that they knew, other commanders who were now working with the Taliban, what their intention was and how they were going to wait us out. And one of the things that these commanders told me was that our military commanders and folks in Washington, they always like to say, people in Washington weren't listening to them. They weren't adhering to what their warnings were about this war, about this fight, and how this war was going to take a lot out of us. They are brilliant fighters. And over the last few years, we've seen a resurgence in the Taliban that we didn't expect. I think some people didn't expect. I think others did. One of the interesting things that I've been looking into is how a lot of these imams are coming from Pakistan and setting up shop in places in the north where we didn't see a lot of influence of the Taliban 3 or 4 years ago, and now we're seeing the Taliban gain strongholds in the north where they were pretty relatively free of that in the past. And we're seeing an intense recruitment effort by both Arab fighters and other influence from Iran and other players in the region, which is making that very, very difficult as time goes on. So yes, I do believe there are still people there that are willing to fight, but we have to have a real commitment. See, we have to give, in a sense, we have to give the Afghan people something more to believe in than what the Taliban is offering, and we have to make them believe that. And unfortunately, a lot of the younger Afghans in the south are being swayed and being recruited by the Taliban and by these Arab fighters, and we have to be very cautious about what we're doing right now. And you're right, Afghanistan has to accept responsibility for Afghanistan. We cannot, fundamentally, we cannot supply Afghanistan with so much funding and just watch it disappear without seeing any change. So,
and I would add just briefly, since we're getting toward the end, the problem in Afghanistan is, and to the Middle East larger is that the Afghanis do not think in terms of a nation. They think in terms of their tribe or their region. So really, we're projecting on them this idea of an Afghan nation and government and central government, whereas, you know, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, it's been a tribal society where people think in terms of their tribe. If you're, you know, if you work for the government and you're not stealing money for your tribe, it's considered unethical. I mean, that's the real problem there.
I want to ask Sarah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sarah,
Hi.
I want to ask you, how intense is the penetration of gangs coming out of Mexico and consequently from different Al-Qaeda and different organizations within the United States? Do you have knowledge of that? Because I heard that they have been taking over, they're controlling our prisons, these gangs.
Oh.
And that they have been establishing themselves within communities, i.e. Westchester. I was told that there's a little nucleus there. Is that something that you know about?
Yeah, I've covered Mexico for quite a long time, and I still do, and I plan on taking a trip there soon. Mexico is one of the stories that is not getting enough attention in the media. I mean, every once in a while there's a story that pops out because there's a gun battle in Matamoros, or they've said, you know, the Mexican army is trying to stabilize a part of a city that's been under siege for years by the drug cartels. Sure, they have infiltrated this. I mean, we're not talking about gangs anymore. Those are just small factions of a massive cartel system, I call them drug czars, that have built armies in Mexico, that have infiltrated the Mexican government as well as other government agencies. They have more weapons and more capabilities than our Border Patrol agents or than some of our own agencies along the U.S.-Mexico border. They have built transit routes into the United States and tunneling systems that we haven't even discovered yet. They're moving dope, they're moving contraband of all types, and more so than that, it's a national security issue for all of us. Because if they can make their way into this country and they have this type of power, they can transport, knowingly or unknowingly, anything into this country for the right price. These organizations also have, because you got to think of them as an organization, they have connections globally. It's not just that Chapo Guzman lives in Sinaloa and grows heroin. I mean, it's not like he's some little guy with a crop duster or, you know, a plane. I mean, they have submarines. They have connections overseas. They're moving their dope through Africa to reach the European continent because they haven't been able to move enough supply into the United States. And then you got to think to yourself, and I'll wrap this up because I could see Frank out of the corner of my eye. Then you got to think, well, if they're moving their foot soldiers into parts of Africa, they're making connections there with other folks. They're talking and they're making deals. This is no longer just regional. This is a global problem, just like terrorism. And we have to look at the world with bigger eyes and a wider scope.
Well, that's why those folks are here, so.